Dear viewers, this is Shameem Rassam welcoming you to today's edition of Global Exchange. It is very sad that once again we must open our program with news of yet another day of violence in the Middle East. As you all know, there was an incident that happened yesterday in the occupied territories. And the more we think that we have seen the worst, yet another news report comes telling us that even a worse incident has happened. Let's take a look at this recent report on what happened yesterday in the Middle East.
10 Palestinians were killed Tuesday, 8 of them in an Israeli missile attack on offices of the militant Islamic group Hamas in the West Bank town of Nablus. 2 senior members of the group's political wing were among the victims, as were 2 children, brothers, who were outside the building. After the attack, Palestinians poured out onto the streets of Nablus, calling for revenge. In Gaza, the spiritual leader of Hamas, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, vowed Israel will pay a heavy price for shedding Palestinian blood. In Jerusalem, Ronan Gissin, a spokesman for Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, said the strike was a preventive measure.
And this particular group was involved in the past in several terrorist activities and was preparing right now at the moment that they were struck additional terrorist and sabotage activities against Israeli citizens. And I can reveal now that it was the target, or the destination, if you want, was Jerusalem.
A statement released by Prime Minister Sharon, who was meeting with members of an economic forum in Jerusalem Tuesday, expressed regret for the deaths of the 2 boys. Following the attack, there were anti-Israel protests on the West Bank and in Lebanon and Jordan. The United States condemned the Israeli missile strike, calling it excessive and highly provocative.
We were going to be talking today on how we can find a solution to this continuing violence. Today in our program we will not be talking about specific of the conflict, nor will we be finger pointing at who is to blame. But what is more important is to find a solution to this problem if we can. As we say, the conflicts do not exist only in the Middle East, as you very well know, but they exist everywhere in the world. In our program today, we will meet an organization and learn about this organization that is achieving some success in finding solutions to conflicts. And today we have 2 guests from this organization. It's a search for common ground. It's an international, non-profit, non-governmental organization that is carrying out projects not only in the Middle East, but also in Burundi, Angola, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Macedonia, the Ukraine, the United States, and also the conflict between the United States and Iran. Here to tell us more about the principles of conflict resolution and the operation of this organization is Mr. John Marks, the founder and president of this organization and its sister organization, the European Center for Common Ground. Also joining us is Dr. Aziz Saeed, who is a board member of Search for Common Ground and the director of the Center for Global Peace, and also a professor of international relations at the American University here in Washington. He is the author of a dozen books on international politics, including peace and conflict resolution in Islam and ethnicity in an international conflict. So welcome to Global Exchange. As I said in my introduction, we will not be talking about the history of this conflict, particularly the conflict in the Middle East, because it's familiar to everybody. And we were going to start with our program with something else. But let's talk about what happened yesterday, which we saw in the report, with what is happening today, reported by the news that more than 100,000 Palestinians walked at the funeral for yesterday's victims. Arab newspapers today called for revenge. you are specialists and experts in peaceful conflict resolution. How do such events affect your work?
Of course, this has a lot of influence on the area. We, working in the field of conflict management, we do have our emotions, we have our own ways of thinking, our own passions, and of course those things affect us. However, what is important is to find ways and means through which we can mediate and find a solution to this issue. I am quite sad. As an Arab American, I am very, very saddened, and I believe any other person would be as sad. But the question is, what are the mechanisms through which we can find a solution to the conflict? And we have a problem in understanding these mechanisms. You know, the toolbox, it's basically the box, you have all the tools, the equipment. This toolbox lacks a lot of expertise and lacks the Western history. The history of conflict in the West provides a lot of expertise, and the toolbox that we have in the Middle East does not include tools that come from other cultures, from other parts of the world. In order to understand the conflict in an area, we have to understand not only the issues, but the cultural underpinnings, the needs. For example, now, what are the needs of the Palestinians? What are the needs of the Israelis? The needs of the Palestinians are justice, 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 justice. And the needs for the for the Israelis is security. And then how can we find a common ground in order to secure justice to the Palestinians and guarantee security to the Israelis?
I agree with you, and I certainly agree with you, sir. But I would like to go to Mr. John Marks and ask him about what Dr. Saeed said about this common ground, and that the European experience with this toolbox, or the elements of this toolbox, is not the same and is different from what is required for the peaceful settlement of the conflict in the Middle East. But I don't understand this quite. Wasn't the conflict in the Middle East calling also for justice and security?
Yeah. Well, like Dr. Saeed, my friend Dr. Saeed, I deplore the violence, and I share his sadness. It's terrible what's happened. And it's not helpful. And I think what we need is a way of, if you will, synthesizing the history, the culture, the traditions of the Middle East with some of the experience in the West in conflict management and the like. But there's a problem here, is that our toolbox is not very effective in comparison to the Kalashnikov, in comparison to violence. In other words, our toolbox isn't that good. I wish it were better. I wish it were stronger. I wish there were magical ways. But unfortunately, at times like this, though there are things one can do, you can bring people together, you can have conversations, you can have dialogue. When the passions are so strong as they are, when you see pictures as we have just seen, it's very, very difficult to do our work. Now, we are committed to continuing this kind of work. We are committed to continuing. I believe with all my heart, with all my soul, in peaceful solution to these problems, and eventually we're going to get there. Today, it doesn't look as likely as it might, but we must remember that peace processes go up and down. There is nothing consistent about. We've had moments of elation as people who want peace in the Middle East, along with moments of despair. This is one of those moments of despair, but it's very important, it seems to me, to continue and to have this commitment to peaceful solution of conflict.
John talked about the toolbox. What is important, or the difference, when I spoke about the American and the European Western expertise, yes, of course, there were issues having to do with justice and security, and the historical expertise is, for the Arabs, for the Muslims, for the Palestinians, is quite different. There's no question about it. For in any conflict, there is a need for justice, there's a need for security. However, However, when we talk about the toolbox basically is the result of a certain level of maturity that has taken place as a result of the interaction between European countries and the United States, influenced by Western civilization, by Western history. And they do not, and the toolbox does not have the necessary tools to deal with the current situation in the Middle East.
Nevertheless, some people in the Arab region might say, how come? What about the Arab American intellectual? And aren't there organizations who can tap Arab American intellectuals, call them and seek to find solutions, peaceful solutions for this conflict? This is what is happening now.
We've started understanding how to settle this issue. I think the dialogue is new. Prior to the 80s, people looked at international relations are basically relations among European countries. But however, today, most countries in the world are non-Western, they're non-European, and their cultures are different. So I think starting in the 80s, in the United States and now also in Europe and other countries, there felt a need to study how to manage and resolve conflicts. And when we talk about peace, we have distinguished between whether we're talking scientifically or politically. We have separated justice from security. Today, we see that when we talk about peace, we have to bring those two back together. Security and justice have to go together. You cannot just distinguish among them. In the old days, we used to say only, security only without justice, or vice versa. So
then this change that has been adopted by your organization of mixing and merging peace and security, that is what is happening. We also talked about the mechanisms that have to be present in this toolbox, in this virtual toolbox, to find a peaceful solution to this conflict. What is lacking in your current toolbox?
Well, what is lacking is an ability to bring Israelis together with Arabs, with Palestinians in a way that makes a difference. We don't have the power to do that. Unfortunately, the U.S. government doesn't have the power to do it. The convening power is not such. Neither side has the incentive, whatever that would be. I wish this were not so, but we as the peacemakers have been in many ways swept aside by the violence of the situation. And when things reach a certain level, they probably have to play themselves out before you can get back to dialogue. I mean, we're back in a period as we were 10 years ago when there's virtually no communication between the two sides. Now, we try to bring people together. We try on an unofficial level to continue the meetings to make sure that there is a safety net, that people can talk. But unfortunately, it doesn't work very well when leaders are being bombed in Nablus and when you have the problems in Tel Aviv with the discotheque. When that kind of violence is around, the emotions get to a point that the peacemaking process gets swept aside. So I don't have an easy answer to this one. I wish I did. I wish to God that I did, but I don't.
When we speak about mechanisms, for example, at the American University, we have a program called Peace in Islam. We try to understand how, historically, within Islam and among Islamic relations with other countries, how were disputes and conflicts resolved. And we're trying to understand that, and as a result, we're extracting mechanisms. So when we speak of mechanisms, as John mentioned, we have to find those mechanisms that are truly effective and those that of course have been used and had led to positive results. I would like now to speak, I would love to speak more. However, our colleague Basil Salama, Jordan Television over the seas, we welcome you. and also welcome all those working at your studios. Please go ahead with your question.
In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate. Greetings, Shameem, and greetings to your studio guests from me and from all my colleagues here in Jordanian television. We are talking about the common ground between the Israelis and the Palestinians. My first question is, how can we find this common ground when the spokespeople for the Israeli government and everything, all the indications show that Israel is preparing for war? And we all believe that all the Palestinian demands are subject to Israel's acceptance, and they are not they're not being supported by forces and laws in the world and the international community. How would you comment on that, sir?
My colleague Ibrahim, the first lesson in any attempt to settle a conflict, the first lesson is that both parties should want peace. They should be ready for peace. So whenever one of the parties says or acts on the grounds against a desire for peace, there's a problem. That is why this issue is very, very important. When we teach academically about conflict management and resolution, the first thing we tell the students, there is a difference between those who say we are preparing for war and those who say we are preparing for peace. And your comment is quite important. It is very important for both parties to accept the move towards peace. Unless both do that, we will never go to peace. We have learned from this historically that the cost for peace is quite high, and of course leaderships have to pay this high price, first of all.
Both sides need to accept that the common ground is that they have to find a way to live together. There's no choice. Both sides would prefer perhaps that were not so, but they're there. There are millions of people on both sides, and there is no choice, and that's the starting point. Now, one side now has much more force than the other, and so there's a real need for them to kind of see that they need to combine security with justice, as Abdul Aziz just said, and that's the common ground.
Sir, please go ahead, Mr. Salama. Many people, many analysts interpreted the recent Israeli measures to lay the foundation of another temple as an Israeli attempt to push the region, entire region, more deeply into struggle and conflict for the purpose of increasing the popularity of Sharon among the ultra-right wing. Jewish extremist groups all over the world are supporting him, and this will force the whole problem further into making it a religious problem.
Unfortunately, my personal opinion is that the Al-Aqsa, the Intifada, the uprising took place in Al-Aqsa. We found for the first time Palestinians within Israel protesting, demonstrating, and organized. This is a signal that the religious issue, the religious dimension, has now part of the problem. And that is a problem, because when religion is mixed to the conflict, it becomes much more difficult to resolve it. And that is why when we speak of mechanisms to solve the conflict, and when we speak about finding a common ground, it is important to find within the various religions that common ground. Lately I was in Philadelphia, speaking to the Philadelphia Inquirer newspaper, speaking to the editors, and they've asked me a number of questions. And they asked me, among those, what is your opinion? Give us your comment from a historical perspective on the conflict. And I mentioned, unfortunately, the Israeli and many of the American Jews do not know the history and the partnership, historic partnership that has existed in Andalusia, in the Andalus, between the Jews and the Arabs, in the history of Islam. So when there is a view of the Arab and the Muslim, he's always viewed as rejecting the others, which is not true. So when you speak on common ground, we speak of education, of culture, we speak of informing important issues, informing the people, of all important issues.
What is very grave in these recent measures is that they have been conducted with the blessings and the support of the Israeli government. These positions are empowering not only, are empowering many others, including these extremist religious organizations. Doesn't this indicate or signal that a resolution and a solution is going to be impossible with the Palestinians?
Yeah. I don't think it's ever impossible to make peace. I think that both sides have to give up some things. I think both sides are not going to get 100% of what they want, but in the end, they don't have any choice. In the end, that's where the culture is going to take us. That's where the negotiations will take us. Today, I sound almost crazy when I say something like that, because when people are in the middle of a conflict, the emotions are so high, the tendency to want revenge is so high that it's very difficult. But I know that in the end, they're going to find the peace, and that even the religious extremism, and there's religious extremism on both sides at this point, will probably be will be moderated, and that the moderate center, most people want peace, they want solutions to their problems, and we're going to find it eventually. So let's get it there sooner rather than later.
عفوا عندما تحدثنا
as you mentioned, Dr. Abdul Aziz, you said that you were in Philadelphia and you talked with a group of editors at the Philadelphia Inquirer, and you said then that it has to do with a knowledge of culture and history. In other words, a knowledge of culture and history is required in order to solve a problem. And this knowledge is required on both sides. So, in spite of the fact that much is known on both sides, by both sides, about the other side, there are those who have created a stereotype that is distorted and that is inaccurate. So there is a history for this stereotype. So given that, how can we find a solution given the stereotype?
In any conflict, there is always distortion of and stereotyping. For example, now at the university, I have students from Cyprus, the Turkish Cyprus as well as the Greek Cyprus, part of Cyprus. They've been here for 5 weeks now, and we're working together in order to help each side give an image, truly put a face to that enemy, because the enemy has always been looked at in a distorted fashion, and to give that enemy the real image, the real face, and not the one that has been stereotyped. And basically the Turkish side stereotypes and distorts the image and the culture of the Greek side, and vice versa. So that is why it is very important for a dialogue to take place, in order so they can meet once again and to discover the true face of the other side and not the distorted one. So the Jew, whether he's an American, whether he's an Israeli, whether he's a radical or whether he's a moderate, he should know the true face of the Arab and the Muslim. And the Arab and the Muslim should also know the true history of the Jew. You know, there was a partnership between Islam and Judaism in the old days. This is very important. This is on the one side. However, that in and of itself is not enough, and that is why we have also to address and talk about solutions. Probably the biggest and the most important challenge, I mentioned this to American officials, to Israeli officials, to Palestinian officials, the most important challenge is the following. There is no common perception of peace. Each side is saying they want peace, but there is no common perception of peace. So how will that peace be? How will the peace be to the Palestinian who wants an independent sovereign state and has respect and has its own capital, and it is in Jerusalem? And how also, how will the future of Israel be under that peace? This is what we need. We have to find that common vision and common vision of that peace. Yes, of course, a common perception, having the same features. Of course, they were talked about Sharon. Sharon, like any other official, like any head of state, has his own needs. As an Arab American today, when I read the newspaper, and the State Department condemned, however, the White House did not. So why didn't the White House deny it? Because for the White House, because the presidential elections were quite tight, as we know, the results were very close. So American American foreign policy towards the Palestinian cause is an extension of its domestic policy, and that is the reason why the White House and for President George W. Bush, he has his own interests. It is important for him to succeed in dealing with Congress to pass legislation. That is his priority right now because that is his domestic policy. However, the State Department, focuses on the foreign policy, and that is why it has condemned this. Okay, I will go back to the stereotyping issue. And John, you have prepared a number of programs. Television programs, from what I understood. Since 1987, you have started doing this work, and you have established specific programs for targeting African countries. And what if in putting these programs together for the Arab region, and we know that those programs were successful in Africa, what are the differences here when we talk about the Middle East, if we were to deal with that and keeping in mind that it is a different culture and understanding, of course, the differences? Is there an obstacle? Are there things that have to be overcome?
There certainly are obstacles. In Africa, we've done things where in the middle of an ethnic conflict, we've done a series called Heroes in Burundi, where it's a series about people, Hutus who saved the lives of Tutsis, and Tutsis who saved the lives of Hutus. In other words, in an ethnic conflict, people on either side have been saving the lives on an individual level of their so-called enemy. So what's going on there? And we try to show that in our programs because people are very interested. They all know these stories, but yet it's not something they talk about. It's not public. And we're trying to infuse the culture with an idea that not being violent is possible, with reaching across ethnic lines, which going across the stereotypes is possible. And we do these programs very successfully. And about 80% to 90% of the people in the country think it's a good idea. In a problem, if you ask me, what's the obstacle in the Middle East? The media in both sides doesn't have a lot of space for this kind of idea. The prevailing view tends to be, they're my enemy. And we don't want to, the images we want to see are not the images of people coming together. If I were to go to television stations in the Middle East with this kind of programming, I don't think there would be a great receptivity. We've tried before, and we think it's very important. Now, some people want it, but they say, we have a guild in my country. The journalists would not be, it would not be possible to do programs about positive side of the positive traits of the other side. We're doing it with Greeks and Turks right now. of all, they're doing a series of documentaries, TV documentaries of all the things they have in common. And they have many, many things in common, in addition to their enmity, if you will, or their opposition to each other. But in the Middle East right now, the climate is not such. We try, we push, but it's very, very difficult. It's not what the media thinks they want at this time.
When John talks about common ground, in history and in the Islamic and Arabic experience, one of the most important contributions, achievements, some of the most important achievements of the Arab and Islamic culture has been cultural pluralism, racial pluralism. And the common ground here, when we speak about Israel, and one of the worst tragedies, if you want, of the Jewish history is that they have been the victims of not having had cultural pluralism in the West. Because the West did not have cultural and religious pluralism, so they were the victims of that. While on the other hand, Islam has a tradition of cultural and religious pluralism, and the Jews need that. So this is part of the common ground. And when we speak about a common ground, because historically, this has happened historically. I mean, you know, when I speak in the 21st century, one of the most important types of conflict in the 21st century were the ethnic and religious conflicts. And when we speak about mechanisms to solve those, the toolbox of the West does not have the necessary tools and the cultural tools. When we speak about American liberalism, Western liberalism, one of the most important achievements of Western liberalism has been political pluralism. But one of the most important achievements of Islam has been cultural pluralism. And what we need now in this new 21st century is this cultural pluralism. And this is really the common ground between the West and Islam as well. The West can provide political pluralism, and Islam can provide cultural pluralism.
So if I were going to translate what my friend Aziz has just said into a television program, I might be interested in doing to create a successful model, say about Spain in the 14th century. It was an Islamic country, and people lived together, Jews and Christians and Arabs lived together very successfully. So instead of always concentrating on the place they're not living together so successfully, perhaps we could show a model where they are living together successfully. And people in the Middle East today might think, well, how could we do it more like it was done in Spain in the 14th century? And then, of course, that ended when the Christians retook the country in 1492, 100%, expelled the Jews and expelled the Muslims, and that was the end of pluralism in Spain. But there are a couple of hundred years of very good, successful relationships, and I think you find that in Morocco historically. You find it in Lebanon for a long time, though not anymore. And that's the thing is the media can look for the examples of what works, not always what doesn't work, and that's part of finding the common ground.
Okay, comment on what John has mentioned when he said that we find cultural diversity in the past. And in today's reality, that has been lost. That is true. That is true. That cultural diversity has been lost. But it has been lost in the Middle East after the introduction of nationalism and the concept of nationalism, which came from the West. So pluralism existed before. Yes, it did exist, cultural pluralism. So in other words, we basically copied something from the West with its superficiality, that the concept of belonging, the national identity, and in adopting that we lost our cultural diversity? Yes, yes, because American concepts of nationalism are different from ours. We used to have there was cultural pluralism in the Afghani empire, under the Ottoman, under the Abbasid. Instead, what we have, the Western concepts of nationalism coming from the West came in and infused and changed the whole situation. This is a very major topic, of course, but I think our colleague Basil is waiting for us in Jordanian television studios. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Shameem. I have one comment on what you were discussing with regard to the stereotypes between the violence that both parties are responsible for. All the agreements that have been reached in the Mitchell report and the Tenet agreement equate between the aggressor and the victim. So I want to ask, who is responsible for this violence? Who is responsible for the hundreds of victims and martyrs? What would you say, what would you gentlemen say to the families of these victims? The families are being subjected to bombardment and gunfire continuously. What do we tell them? What do we tell them about who is responsible for this violence? And what about the Arab situation and the Arab position that is holding a lot of hope on intervention by the Americans? And how will the Americans deal with this situation after this recent escalation of violence? Will they try to find practical solutions to this conflict? But before I give the microphone to Dr. Abdul Saeed, I agree with you that dialogue and this conversation is the foundation for finding this common ground. We all feel that what happened on the Arab ground is tragic, but let's not move away from the topic of today's conversation and dialogue, which is trying to find a peaceful solution to this conflict. And what happened recently puts us back and does not bring us closer to finding a peaceful solution. I just wanted to make this point clear. Is there a change in the role that the United States is playing and what's happening now?
The new American administration so far, as of today, the team that is in charge now is being completed. In other words, the formation of the team was not completed, so the complete review of the situation is now being completed. And that is why when I recently visited the Arab world, my brothers and sisters told me we had hoped that Bush was going to adopt a new policy towards the region. And my comment is the following, is that the Republican Party right now is not like the old Republican Party. This Republican Party right now is very much influenced by the Christian evangelists and what is the evangelical Christians and what is called the Christian right. And the Christian right in the United States has a lot of influence on American foreign policy when we speak of the Middle East in support of Israel. This is a very important reality to keep in mind when we think about and analyze this issue. And since the results, again, were so close, the results of the presidential elections, the domestic policy, the interest in domestic policy within the White House is much higher than the focus on foreign policy. That's one point. There is another point. U.S. foreign policy towards the Middle East is basically an extension of its domestic policy. So what I'm trying to say is I do not have any great hopes from this administration, and I also say to Basil, as an Arab American and as other Arab Americans, or the rest of Arab Americans, we are quite saddened and we feel the pain of what is happening. And that's what I wanted to comment on. finding a solution to the conflict, as I had mentioned to the Philadelphia Inquirer, will take place not because of the White House, but despite of the White House. And that is why it is very important right now for Arab countries to coordinate among themselves and come up with a common policy towards the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. They should coordinate. Since the second Camp David II, Israel and those supporting Israel, they come and proposing one proposal after the other in Washington. The Arabs have not presented yet a single proposal. They should present proposals that could be worked upon.
More unfortunate parts of this conflict is that it has flared up at a time of transition in the United States. And the United States has a very peculiar political system. We pretty much stopped functioning as a government for about a year while we do one of these transitions. And because it didn't happen 4 years ago with Bill Clinton, most of us have forgotten how it works. But literally there has been no one home in the administration working on the Middle East policy for much of the last 6-7 months because they're in a transition period. Well, the world can't wait for these things to happen, but unfortunately that's the reality of the American political system. And I wish that weren't so, but it is so. There is another reality at work here. I think that you can say that the power, the influence of Arab Americans is much greater now than it has been before in our history. I think that before, from an ethnic point of view, Jewish Americans had very little in the way of, if you will, counterbalance from the Arab American side. Now, there, I believe, as many Arab Americans in the country as Jewish Americans, and if you could add in Islamic Americans, there are more. And I think that's starting to play out in American politics. I noticed President Bush during the campaign saying some things about that were spoken directly to Arab Americans in a key state like Michigan, where they have a very large plurality. And I think so we have a changing American politics domestically, which should have some impact, because I agree completely with my friend Aziz that American policy in the Middle East reflects very closely American domestic politics.
My question, what, in your opinion, is the most likely party that can dictate to Israel compliance with the agreements that it signed with the Palestinians, especially since the United States and Europe have failed to persuade Israel to change its aggressive policies?
The continuation American efforts, and especially the continuation of European efforts, and reinforcing multilateralism and international efforts through the UN. In our work in finding a resolution to a conflict, this is one thing we look to, is how to reinforce that. And today at the American University we find a stronger voice find a stronger voice for Arab Americans, as John mentioned. For example, next Thursday I will go to Ohio, to Antioch University, to talk to students from a number of universities about the current situation in the Middle East. There are Arab professors, Arab American professors, Arab American scientists, and organizing a forum for us to express a view. However, to answer your specific question, we have to renew the efforts, increasing efforts in dealing with the Congress of the United States. The media in the United States are very important. These are important. American media. Unfortunately, the U.S. Congress's position towards the conflict, towards the Palestinian cause, is 100% in support of Israel. For example, 6 weeks ago, I was at the Center for World Peace and Global Peace, the one I'm responsible for, and I went to Congress to discuss the issue of lifting the sanctions imposed on Iran and Libya. And for the first time, we were able to have that dialogue. So now we have, increasing dialogue, which is good.
Right. I think it's very unlikely, to respond to the caller, that you're going to find either American party imposing peace on Israel. It's not in the cards. It will not happen. I think peace has to come from the region. The Americans can be helpful. I think this administration is less likely than the last one to intervene even strongly in the peace prospect. I don't think we find right now, at least, people in this administration who have a strong emotional tie to the Middle East and who have taken it on as their personal issue nearly as much as we did in the last administration. Well, maybe that's a good thing or a bad thing, but I think it's a reality. And the kind of intervention that we need at the moment, this administration does not seem likely to do it. Now, there was a hope, I think it was an old hope, that because of the ties of this administration to oil interests, petroleum interests, that there would be an intervention. But I don't think that's nearly as strong in American politics as the influence of the Christian right, the influence of Jewish Americans and the like. And I don't think that this administration, for petroleum oil reasons, is likely to make the kind of move that I think the caller would have liked, or the person in Jordan would have liked him to make.
My final question. We are talking about non-governmental organizations and international organizations for peaceful conflict resolution, like the Red Cross and Amnesty International and your organizations and so on and so forth. My question is, why is it that we have not heard from these organizations one position? To indicate, to point the finger at the party that is responsible for the violence that is happening now and for the violations against human rights that are occurring every day.
Many NGOs and many human rights organizations and many Christian American, not the evangelical ones, but other mainstream American Christian organizations have expressed their views. When you visit the United States and you read the local and regional newspapers and attend conferences and seminars, you will find that. When we speak of the organizations whose aim is conflict management, these organizations are tried on purpose to remain neutral in order to assist in resolving the conflict. As for the other NGOs, human rights and others, they do express their views and they condemn and they express themselves freely on this issue.
Yeah, no, our commitment as an organization is to the process of making peace. And though I as an individual see grave injustice in what's going on, I'm not going to sit here and condemn one side or the other. No. That's not my job. I have a different job. And as a human being, I of course have my personal views, but as my work is to try to make peace in the area. And if one says one side is absolutely wrong and the other side is absolutely right, it becomes impossible to make peace. That's a basic tenet of our work.
Yeah.
I would like to thank my colleague Basil Salama from Jordanian Television for participating in our program today. And we are continuing our program with you from our studios here in Washington. There's something that I hope we will talk about. You said, Dr. Abdul Aziz, that there has been change in our society and that the Arab Americans now have a voice and that is much better than in the years past. You said now, for example, an example of this is that you serve in this organization and you serve in other organizations. That has resulted in the fact that there are many Americans who believe in justice and security for all. When Basil asked a question about the Arab position and the Arab American position, are the media responsible for the fact that they are not covering what Arab Americans are doing?
Both media, Arab and American media, both are responsible, and this is why it is very important for Arab Americans to launch media campaigns in the United States. For example, today in New York City, about $800 million are spent annually to support Israeli causes, to support Israeli interests through the American media. There is an incredible effort through the American media to show the Israeli point of view. There's no counterpart. There's no counterpart when it comes to the Arabs. Yes, we know that Arab embassies try to do that. They try as governments to do that. We want a media that is non-governmental. John, when you mentioned that there are obstacles to reach, that there are certain programs show both views, and you said it is hard to get that to the Arab viewer. Do you think, in your opinion, it is fine to find, is it possible for the neutral media in the Arab world that can it influence and get its views through the American media?
Well, I think the American and the Western media can have an impact. I think also that another potential for this way of thinking is the satellite television. That's become so popular, which has changed the face of media in the Middle East. And I think that we should be seeing more, at least from some of that satellite television, more of this kind of media. There are new technologies available through the internet. We've started something called the Common Ground News Service, which is going out to every newspaper in the Middle East. We send out 4 articles a week that reflect this kind of common ground approach. It tries to attack the stereotypes. It tries to put out a different kind of media. And that goes out to most newspapers in the Middle East at this point. And that's a new technology kind of thing that comes on through the internet. It's a news service, but it's also really a listserv. And so there are ways to communicate. And the monopoly that centralized media have had on media, particularly in the Middle East, is ending. We've seen it most dramatically with the satellite television, which has ended the national government's monopoly. But it also should be happening with the print media and with radio, too. There are new technologies and new ways to make information available.
I don't think we have really answered your question. I will speak based on my experience as an American, as a writer, as an author, as a professor. The Washington Post, the New York Times, the LA Times, will they give me the same opportunity as to those who would defend Israel? No. Of course, the situation today is better than before. But will American television programs give me the same opportunity or equal opportunity as an Arab American? No. Most of articles are rejected. Oh, one article would be rejected. There's no question about it that the situation today is much better than it was 10 years ago. But this is why I say it is very important, as John has mentioned, we have to find Arab media here, local. This is very important.
Okay, some people may say, in response to what you said, sir, and you said that there are programs that cost $800 million supporting the Israeli position. And some people also say that the Israeli position is a unified one, but that the Arab position and even the Arab American position is contains divisions, and this is because there are many states representing the Arab point of view. Do you think that this has an influence and an effect on the activities here and on the common ground?
It does influence at a number of levels American-Arab relations, especially Arab-American relations, especially since the Gulf War, because there was a large number of Arab Americans who were opposed to the Gulf War, and the war took place. But when it comes to the issue of Palestine, they are in agreement. When it comes to the Palestinian cause, Arab Americans have one voice. When things have to do with other issues like Syria, like Lebanon, the presence of Syria and Lebanon, others, that's a different issue. You'll find a variety. However, it is important to unify the Arab voice even more and to elaborate that view much better.
Important also to say that the Jewish population in the United States is very diverse. You have people who support Israel 100%, and you have people that oppose them 100%, and all gradations in between. So I think it's a mistake to think that there is a unified Jewish lobby in the United States. I think, like the United States with all ethnic groups, there's pluralism in the Jewish community as there is in the Arab community and most other ethnic communities.
I perhaps should have added something else, not just one voice and speaking with one voice, but they are more organized. That is true. That is true.
Of course. Increased organization is very important because, basically Arab American organization in a way reflect the reality of the Arab world. But to comment on what John has mentioned, yes, when we say Arab Americans having one voice when it comes to Palestine, we do have our differences on how we deal with those issues and how we deal with the issue. And I'm one of those who say the non-violence is much more effective than violence. This is my position. And I have written a number of articles lately in the Al Hayat newspaper. Others say, no, violence should be the way. So there are differences around the means, but there is no difference or divergence of view when it comes to supporting Palestinian sovereignty, a Palestinian state, and to have a Palestinian capital in Jerusalem. As Arabs, we agreed. The broad lines are the same, we agree to.
I would have liked to talk more about the role of young people because we believe in the young generation, but I think our time is almost up. But I hope that we can follow up on this subject and focus on young people. How can we take advantage of these young minds and these energetic minds to find this?
And we at the Common Ground organization focus a lot on youth. Of course, we have to depend on them.
I would like to thank everybody, and particularly our two studio guests, Dr. Abdul Saeed and Mr. John Marks, for joining us today. I also want to thank my colleague Basir Salama from Jordanian Television for joining us, as well as all our viewers. For additional information on Global Exchange, please visit our website at www.ibb.gov/worldnet. For Global Exchange, this is Shameem Rassam signing off.